This happened. There are records. Stamped, signed, archived. And yet, almost no one remembers it. Not because it was insignificant. Not because it was unclear. But because remembering it would expose something far more dangerous than ignorance. This is the story of a city that was not destroyed by war, nor by natural disaster. It was erased by decision. A decision made quietly, deliberately, and justified with language so cold, so technical, that human lives were reduced to numbers on paper. For decades, the truth remained sealed inside a classified file. A file that was never meant to be read by the public. A file that explained with disturbing clarity why an entire city had to be sacrificed. Not for survival, not for defense, but for political convenience. The file, the document exists, is not a legend, is not speculation, is not a conspiracy theory. It is a real archive, stored under restricted access, cataloged under an intentionally vague title. No dramatic words, no emotional language, just bureaucracy. Inside it are memorandums, internal communications, risk assessments, demographic projections, and one chilling phrase repeated multiple times. Acceptable loss. That phrase did not refer to military equipment. It did not refer to infrastructure. It referred to people, families, workers, children, an entire city categorized as expendable. The city that was never supposed to matter. On official maps, the city was small, strategically insignificant, economically marginal. It did not host powerful industries. It did not house political elites. It did not generate headlines. And that was precisely the problem. In the eyes of those in power, the city offered something valuable. Silence. If it disappeared, few would ask questions. If it suffered, reports could be delayed. If it died, the blame could be diluted. The file makes this explicit, not emotionally, but mathematically. Population density calculations, migration probability models, media impact forecasts. Every variable was measured. Everything except morality. A problem that needed a solution. The crisis did not begin in the city. It began elsewhere in capital offices, conference rooms, and closed-door meetings where political stability was under threat. There was unrest. There were elections approaching. There were alliances at risk. And above all, there was fear. Not fear of an external enemy, but fear of losing control. The file reveals that the city stood in the way of a much larger political objective, one that could not be delayed, negotiated, or publicly acknowledged. Relocating the population would have been expensive. Addressing the underlying issue would have exposed corruption. Doing nothing would have risked political collapse. So another option was chosen. An option never intended to be visible. Language as a weapon. One of the most disturbing aspects of the file is not what it says, but how it says it. No mention of death. No mention of suffering. No mention of responsibility. Instead, there are phrases like manage demographic reduction, operational containment, long-term depopulation viability. This was not an accident. The language was engineered to remove guilt, to transform human catastrophe into administrative procedure. When suffering is described as logistics, accountability disappears. The decision, the final authorization is brief. 3 signatures, 1 date, no dissenting opinions. The plan was approved under the justification of national interest. That phrase appears repeatedly throughout history. And almost always, it means the same thing. Someone else will pay the price. The city was officially designated as non-essential. From that moment on, everything changed. Emergency responses were delayed. Resources were diverted. Warnings were minimized. Reports were altered. Not falsified, simply softened. Enough to maintain plausible deniability. What the city didn't know. The people living there were never informed. They noticed changes, of course. Hospitals became understaffed. Infrastructure repairs stopped. Environmental alerts were ignored. Requests for aid went unanswered. But no one told them why. No one told them that, on paper, they no longer mattered. The file notes this explicitly. Public disclosure may generate undesirable emotional response. In other words, the truth would complicate the plan. A controlled decline. The sacrifice was not immediate. There were no explosions, no dramatic evacuation orders, no official announcement. Instead, the city was allowed to decline. Slowly, predictably, quietly. Enough time for the population to disperse. Enough time for deaths to appear natural. Enough time for history to forget. By the time outsiders noticed something was wrong, it was already too late to assign blame. That too was calculated. Why this was buried, When the file was finally declassified, partially, decades later, it caused almost no reaction. No protests. No trials. No public apologies. Why? Because the city was already gone. Its population scattered. Its name absent from modern discourse. Its story inconvenient. Admitting the truth would not bring anyone back, but it would expose a method that could be used again. This is not an isolated case. The file does not present the sacrifice as exceptional. It presents it as precedent. A successful operation. Low political cost. Minimal media attention. No long-term consequences for those in power. That may be the most disturbing revelation of all. Because if one city could be sacrificed quietly, how many others have been? They did not destroy the city. They managed it. That distinction matters because it explains how something so catastrophic could happen without anyone being held responsible. The file is clear on this point. Direct violence would have drawn attention. Neglect would not. So the strategy was not annihilation. It was abandonment, executed with precision. The illusion of normality. For a time, life appeared unchanged. People went to work. Children went to school. Shops remained open. But beneath the surface, the systems that kept the city alive were being quietly dismantled. The file outlines a phased approach. Phase 1, resource reallocation. Phase 2, administrative delay. Phase 3, environmental exposure. Phase 4, narrative control. None of these phases mention death. Yet death was the inevitable outcome. Phase 1, resource reallocation. Budgets were adjusted. Not eliminated, redirected. Funds once earmarked for infrastructure, healthcare, and emergency response were quietly transferred to priority regions. Officially, this was described as optimization. Unofficially, it was triage. The city was placed at the bottom of every list. When equipment failed, it was not replaced. When specialists retired, they were not reassigned. When shortages appeared, they were documented, but not resolved. The file notes, service degradation will accelerate voluntary migration. In plain terms, make conditions uncomfortable enough, and people will leave on their own. Those who stayed would become statistics. Phase 2, administrative delay. This phase required patience. Permits stalled. Requests were lost. Approvals took months, then years. Not through incompetence, but through design. Every appeal had to pass through multiple layers of bureaucracy. Each layer introduced plausible delay. No single official could be blamed. No single decision could be challenged. The file praises this structure explicitly. Diffused accountability reduces political exposure. Responsibility, when divided finely enough, disappears entirely. Phase 3, environmental exposure. This is where the file becomes harder to read, because this phase acknowledges harm indirectly. There were known risks near the city. Industrial waste, unstable terrain, contaminated water sources. Under normal circumstances, mitigation would have been mandatory. But the city was no longer considered worth protecting. Safety thresholds were adjusted. Monitoring reports were downgraded in priority. Alerts were reclassified as non-critical. The file refers to this as natural attrition, as if illness, displacement, and death were simply acts of geography. The numbers. This is the section that strips away any remaining ambiguity. Tables, graphs, projected outcomes. The population decline was anticipated, even welcomed. The file calculates expected migration rates, increased mortality over time, reduced birth rates, eventual demographic collapse, all within acceptable parameters. There is no outrage in these pages, no hesitation, only efficiency. One line stands out. Human impact remains within tolerable political limits. That sentence alone explains everything. Phase 4, narrative control. This was the final safeguard. Because even quiet suffering can become dangerous if it is noticed. Journalists who investigated were labeled alarmist. Local leaders were reassured privately and ignored publicly. Independent reports were buried under technical jargon. When questions arose, the answer was always the same. There is no evidence of systemic failure, which was technically true. The system was working exactly as intended. What the file doesn't say but implies. Nowhere does the file state outright that the city must die. That would have been illegal. Instead, it creates conditions in which survival becomes increasingly unlikely. This is how responsibility is avoided. No order to kill. No command to evacuate. No explicit intent. Just a sequence of decisions that make any other outcome impossible. The people who stayed Not everyone could leave. The elderly, the sick, those without resources. The file acknowledges this group briefly, coldly. Residual population expected to stabilize at minimal levels. Residual, as if they were debris left behind after a process was complete. Their suffering is not detailed, but its consequences are: increased emergency calls, overwhelmed clinics, rising unexplained fatalities. Each noted, each ignored. The moment it became irreversible. There is a point in the file, a specific date, when the language changes. Before, there is uncertainty. After, there is confidence. By that moment, the population decline had passed a threshold. Recovery was no longer economically justifiable. Intervention was no longer politically useful. The city had crossed into what the file calls terminal administrative status. From then on, the question was not whether the city could be saved, but how quietly it could disappear. Why no one intervened? Some officials knew. The file includes internal objections, brief, cautious, quickly dismissed. Those who pushed too hard were reassigned. Those who persisted were isolated. Those who remained silent were promoted. The system rewarded compliance and punished conscience. The aftermath, without an event. There was no single catastrophe, no defining moment for history books. Just a slow fade. A school closed here. A hospital wing shut down there. Entire neighborhoods emptied. Maps were redrawn. Boundaries adjusted. Eventually, the city stopped being referenced at all. That too was intentional. Why this matters now? Because the file does not end with reflection. It ends with recommendations, guidelines, best practices, lessons learned. The sacrifice of the city is presented as a success, a model, and models are meant to be reused. If this could be done once quietly, it can be done again. Every sacrifice has a beneficiary. The file never asks this question directly, but the answer is everywhere, hidden between budgets, approvals, and sudden progress elsewhere. The city did not disappear into nothing. Its absence created space. The vacuum. When the city began to collapse, something else began to rise. New infrastructure projects appeared on national agendas. Transportation corridors were suddenly reconsidered. Strategic zones were quietly reclassified. All of this happened far from the dying city, but because of it, the file links these developments through timing, not explanation. That was enough. Political stability at a cost. At the highest levels, the sacrifice solved a problem. Unrest was redirected. Opposition movements lost leverage. Negotiations that had stalled for years suddenly advanced. The file notes a measurable outcome: reduction of destabilizing variables. Those variables had names. They had addresses. They lived in the city. By removing the city from the equation, pressure evaporated. No protests. No negotiations. No risk. Economic realignment. Resources did not vanish. They moved. Funding once assigned to emergency mitigation was rerouted to development initiatives elsewhere. The file uses a neutral phrase: capital efficiency redistribution. In reality, it meant this: the city's loss financed someone else's gain. New industrial zones were built. Foreign investments were secured. Employment figures improved nationally. On paper, the country looked healthier than ever. The silence of the markets. Financial institutions reacted favorably. Risk assessments improved. Credit outlooks stabilized. Confidence returned. None of these actors asked about the city. They didn't need to. Their metrics were national, not human. The file treats this as validation. Market response confirms strategic correctness. The city had become irrelevant, even as a moral consideration. Who signed off? Names appear in the margins of the file. Not prominently. Not dramatically. Initials. Titles. Committees. No single villain. That is intentional. Power, when distributed correctly, becomes invisible. The individuals involved continued their careers. Some were promoted. Some retired with honors. Some went on to design similar policies elsewhere. The sacrifice followed them, quietly, as a footnote. What replaced the city? This is where the story becomes undeniable. Satellite imagery attached to the file reveals long-term planning. As the city emptied, the land was repurposed. Not immediately. Not publicly. Years later. A logistics hub. A secured transit corridor. Restricted facilities labeled as non-residential. The file notes this with satisfaction. Territorial optimization achieved. The city was not lost. It was converted. The people who returned. Some survivors came back years later. They found nothing recognizable. streets renamed, buildings demolished, records missing. In some cases, the city itself had been administratively dissolved. Its name no longer existed in official registries. Try to claim compensation for a place that legally never existed. That too was deliberate. The legal shield. The file outlines a strategy for future accountability. Jurisdictional ambiguity. Expired statutes of limitation. Fragmented responsibility. Even if someone tried to challenge the decision, they would face an impossible task. No direct order. No single defendant. No clear crime. Just policy. And policy, the file implies, cannot be immoral, only effective or ineffective. Why the file was censored? When parts of the archive were released, entire sections were redacted. Not the operational failures. Not the demographic data. Those were safe. What was hidden were the benefits. The names of private partners. The economic projections. The post-sacrifice developments. Because those would answer the only question that truly matters. Who needed the city gone? A pattern, not an accident. Cross-referenced with other archives, the file reveals something unsettling. Similar strategies. Different locations. Identical language. The city was not unique. It was simply the first time the method was perfected. After that, it became easier, cleaner, more efficient. The moral calculation. At one point, an internal memo raises a concern. Not about ethics, but optics. Public awareness risk remains low due to demographic profile. The implication is clear. Some populations are easier to erase than others. Not because they matter less, but because fewer people will defend them. What history records and what it doesn't. Textbooks mention economic recovery. They mention infrastructure expansion. They mention political stability. They do not mention the city. History, like policy, favors results, not victims. The file's final recommendation. The last page is brief. No remorse. No reflection. Just guidance. Future applications should maintain plausible deniability and gradual implementation to minimize resistance. That sentence confirms everything. This was not a tragedy. It was a template, and templates are meant to be reused. The city did not vanish overnight. It faded, and fading requires time. Time in which many people notice something is wrong and choose to look away. This is where the file becomes less about policy and more about us. The absence of outrage. There were signs, local reports, rising mortality statistics, disappearing neighborhoods. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediate, just enough to be ignored. The file relies on a simple truth. Outrage requires clarity, and clarity was carefully avoided. No single disaster, no headline moment, no undeniable image. Without a moment to react to, the public remained passive. Media as a buffer. Journalists did investigate. Some traveled to the city. Some published articles. Some raised questions. But without access to the full file, their work appeared fragmented, contradictory, uncertain. Editors softened language. Headlines were rewritten. Stories were buried beneath more urgent news. Not because of censorship, but because of doubt. The file anticipated this. Ambiguity reduces sustained attention. And it was right. Experts who chose neutrality. Academics analyzed the data. They noticed irregularities. They published papers. But they framed the issue carefully. No accusations. No conclusions. Just trends. Just possibilities. The file refers to this group as non-hostile observers. Their neutrality, though well-intentioned, protected the system. When everyone speaks carefully, nothing changes. The comfort of distance. For most people, the city was far away. Different accent, different problems, different lives. The file exploits this distance. Low identification factor reduces mobilization probability. In other words, if people do not see themselves in the victims, they will not act. Empathy, it turns out, has limits. The myth of powerlessness. Many who noticed believed there was nothing they could do. The system was too large. The decisions too complex. This belief was not accidental. The file describes it as psychological containment. When people feel powerless, they stop asking questions. Silence becomes voluntary. The role of bureaucracy. Complaints were filed. Petitions submitted. Requests escalated. Each one received a response. Formal, polite, empty. The appearance of process replaced the reality of action. The file praises this. Procedural engagement reduces dissent escalation. People were not ignored. They were managed. When silence becomes complicity. At no point does the file accuse the public. It doesn't need to. It understands something more unsettling. Systems do not require approval. They only require non-interference. Every moment of indifference became part of the mechanism. Every delayed reaction made the sacrifice easier. Those who tried to speak. A few voices refused silence. Whistleblowers, local organizers, displaced residents. Their stories appear briefly in the file, not as testimonies, but as risks. Emotional narratives may disrupt strategic coherence. Some were discredited. Some were exhausted. Some simply disappeared from public discourse. Not erased, just ignored. The normalization of loss. Over time, the absence of the city became normal. Maps updated. Budgets reallocated. Language adjusted. What was once a crisis became background noise. The file notes this moment with approval. Issue fatigue achieved. Once fatigue sets in, memory follows. Why no apology was issued? An apology would have acknowledged intent. It would have named victims. It would have forced accountability. The file explicitly advises against it. Symbolic gestures increase liability exposure. Silence, in contrast, costs nothing. The collective mirror. This is the most uncomfortable part, because the file did not succeed alone. It relied on our short attention spans, our trust in procedure, our willingness to move on. The city was sacrificed by policy, but it was forgotten by society. What remains? No monument, no memorial, no official recognition, only footnotes, only data, only silence, which may have been the point all along. The warning embedded in the file. The final annotations do not celebrate the outcome. They analyze it. Public tolerance for gradual loss exceeds projections. That sentence is not about the past. It is about the future. Because a society that accepts silence once will accept it again. The file does not end with destruction. It ends with confidence. That may be the most disturbing detail of all. What the file ultimately reveals. When read in full, not as isolated pages, but as a whole, the file exposes something deeper than the sacrifice of a single city. It reveals a doctrine, a way of thinking, a belief that human geography can be adjusted the same way borders are redrawn, quietly, incrementally, without consent. The city was not an anomaly. It was a proof of concept. The final redactions. Even in its partially declassified form, the file is incomplete. Entire paragraphs are blacked out, names erased, locations removed, but the structure remains visible. You can still see where decisions were made. You can still trace cause and effect. You can still understand intent. What is hidden is not the crime. What is hidden is the continuity. Because acknowledging continuity would force one unavoidable question. Is this still happening? The question no one answers. Every inquiry into the file ends the same way. Officials say it belongs to another era, another political climate, another set of circumstances. And yet, the language persists. Strategic realignment. Population optimization. Acceptable loss. Different words. Same logic. The file does not belong to the past. It belongs to a method. Why the city still matters. The city no longer exists on maps, but it exists as precedent. It proves that a population can be erased without violence. A tragedy can occur without an event. Accountability can dissolve through procedure. That knowledge did not disappear with the city. It was absorbed. Institutional memory is far more durable than human memory. The survivor's silence. Those who live through it rarely speak. Not because they forgot, but because they learned something important. Truth does not guarantee justice. Many tried. They testified. They wrote. They appealed. The system responded exactly as designed. With delay. With ambiguity. With exhaustion. Eventually, silence became a form of self-preservation. The lie of closure. Governments speak often of moving on. The file rejects that idea entirely. There is no closure section. No reconciliation chapter. No moral accounting. Just outcomes. And outcomes in this framework are all that matter. What the file never mentions. There is one thing missing entirely. A sentence you will not find anywhere in the archive. This was wrong. Not once. Not implicitly. Not conditionally. The absence is deliberate. Because admitting wrongdoing would collapse the logic that made the sacrifice possible. The final annotation. At the very end of the file, almost as an afterthought, there is a handwritten note. Not a policy recommendation. A reminder. Effectiveness depends on discretion and time. Time above all. Time allows outrage to fade. Time allows language to soften. Time allows history to blur. Time turns sacrifice into statistics. Why this story was forgotten? Not because it lacked evidence, not because it lacked victims, but because remembering it would force recognition. Recognition that modern power does not always announce itself with force. Sometimes it simply withdraws support and waits. The city as a warning. The city was not destroyed. It was allowed to disappear. That distinction matters, because it means no laws were broken, no emergency declared, no villains exposed, only choices. And choices can always be repeated. The final question. The file closes. The archive is sealed. The city is gone. But the question remains, unresolved, unavoidable. How many cities exist today only because they are still useful? And how many are already marked? Not with weapons, not with threats, but with silence, with neglect, with acceptable loss. This happened. There are records. They were hidden on purpose. And now that you know, the silence is no longer neutral.